Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Patreon only podcast. I think this is the fourth one, the fourth Spotlight podcast. So, yeah, welcome. Hello, Ian. Hello, Keith. Are you both
All right.
okay?
Yeah, good,
Yep.
Martin.
Good, yeah. Jetting off soon, Keith, to the
Yes,
Southern Hemisphere.
next week. Yeah, heading off working trip to Australia. I also have time to see the kids who live there. Stop at Dubai on the way to see my son Mike. And there's a family wedding as well later on.
Wow.
My niece is getting married, so
Yeah,
added value to this trip. But it's a working trip as well. So
yeah. You don't need a bag carrier, do you? Or I don't know,
I've had loads of volunteers for that.
a
So
PA, something. No. You all right, Ian?
Yep, very well. Yep. It's just as hot here at the moment.
is it?
32 today.
Uh,
Humid. That
yeah.
time you don't want to be here, Keith.
Yeah. We're heading straight to Brisbane actually to see my son
Are
there.
you coming? Oh,
Yeah, we'll be up there. So, but it's the humidity. We'll
yeah.
live in aircon for a while. That's the key.
Yeah, that's what it's been. I found I'm working in this room, and then I'm going on a talk, and my throat's gone because
Yeah,
the aircon.
aircon. Yeah, dries out the air up and stuff. So yeah.
It's been
Anyway,
anyway,
There's
all good.
loads of sympathy in as I've got the thermals on and
As
just took the
always,
body warmer off. Yeah, yeah,
that's it. That's it.
feel it, Martin.
yeah. So, yeah. So today we're gonna have a chat about I suppose this dualism that seems to be hanging around forever. This idea of you've got information processing ideas, theory, concepts on the one side, and maybe more ecological um, sort of view of sport performance, the model of the athlete, how they would learn, and all these sort of things on the other side. So, and I think it's fair to say straight off the bat, it's probably quite outdated way of looking at it. And if we think anyway, if we're always focusing on this dualism, you're probably focusing on the wrong things rather than focusing on how we can better support coaches and practitioners, sports scientists to ultimately help athletes get better in a high performance setting or whatever it may be. So that's really what we want to have a chat about today. And I suppose a good place to start might be just a bit of background, Keith. Is that all right? A bit of history around this. I know you
Yeah,
mentioned a conference in 1988, I think it was in Amsterdam or Holland, I think. So
that was the first attempt to
yeah,
look at. So, I mean, one of the things I'll start off by saying, I think it really we're looking at the difference between cognitive psychology and nowadays that that's been updated or upgraded to cognitive science, or some people talk about cognitive neuroscience, but essentially the cognitive view of human behavior and the ecological view of human behavior. And for those who are unfamiliar, may want to know about a bit of the history of it. It's worth going back. So after the Second World War, the cognitive view arose, funnily enough, as a counter to behaviorism, which was quite dominant at the time. And behaviorism is really, I guess, the methods are more suitable for training, for the idea of eventually through training, you can condition a person, an organism, to react in a certain way. So a stimulus appears and a response, a trained response appears. And you can train that response by, if you like, providing negative feedback, punishment, negative feedback for the responses you don't want. And for responses you do want, then you give positive feedback, like rewards. And of course, you can see where that dominated traditional educational methods, as we've talked about, Martin. Anyway, after the
still dominates.
well, it's
Yeah.
still around, some of these feeling. They have a role to play in training. Ian, did you want to comment then?
Yeah, I just thinking from the coaching literature.
Yeah,
I was reading probably the seminal book on the coaching process, which was John Lyle and Chris Cushion's book,
yeah,
which was published 2002, 2003. And then the second edition came out. That was just John on his own. And then 2017 or 16, depending on where you read it. The book I've got is 2017. They talk about the traditional approaches to coaching, and they don't mention ecological at all. So even by 2017, ecological doesn't get a mention. And they're saying that the traditional approach is a mixture of behaviorism still and the cognitive approach. So and then constructivism fits in with that, was more modern, which is they link with game sense or teaching games for understanding.
Oh, they link that.
Yeah, they link that with that as a theory. I mean, I've always argued it. I think it's more ecological when you talk to Rod Thorpe about it, but that's another story. But the fact that there's still a legacy of behaviorism in the traditional approach. So
go ahead, carry on.
So I in my head, I got the cognitive traditional approach, but when you look at some of the methods, it probably is a bit of a mixture. And I was like sorry, I was going to say it's a bit like the cognitive behavioral therapy in psychology or in psychotherapy, isn't it, and things like that. So they call it both, but so is the traditional approach more of a biopsych or
and I think from the idea of calling something a traditional approach, which has been more, for me, that conjures up something historical and a legacy, then that I wouldn't disagree with that. And the ecological approach is kind of the new kid on the block. Well, you say it's the new kid on the block. The ideas have been, if you like, percolating, fermenting since 1980s. I mean, that's when it came onto the scene to challenge cognitive psychology. This is the point I wanted to make, and there was a big debate then. There was a big debate at that time that, people dropped into camps. So there was the sort of the traditional cognitivists, the dominant cognitive theme, and there were lots and lots of textbooks out there espousing the cognitive approach. I remember the first textbook I read, as an undergrad. I was excited about it. Came out in 1976. It came out in my last year as an undergrad. It appeared in the library, and it was like, oh, look at this, and it was by Ron Martiniuk, and it was called Information Processing and Motor Skills. And those were the only texts that you had at that time. And so, people could be forgiven for thinking that was, that was the only approach, if you like. But at the time, even at that point, there were young psychologists like Michael Turvey, and Scott Kelso as a dynamicist, who were dissatisfied with those ideas. And gradually, from the late 70s onwards to throughout the 80s and into the 90s, and now, of course, the ecological approach grew. And, of course, people then picked up on Gibson's work, which was, he was like an isolated soul, kind of howling in the dark to anyone who would listen, by himself, talk about this ecological approach. But really, the cognitive approach was the dominant theme. And as you said, Martin, agreed, it's to some extent, it is still considered by some to be the dominant theme, although ecological psychology, dynamical systems theory, ecological dynamics have made great strides since then. And it's fair to say there's been never been a knockout blow landed by one or the other. So in the 80s, that was when there was a big, there was a great gathering of people in Amsterdam, 1988, the kind of experts from the different sides, and people spoke, presented their ideas, and it was kind of very civil, as it normally is in Dutch society, in a very kind of controlled, and theory and arguments were pushed. And at the end of it, they agreed that they explored what was called compatibility, the idea of integrating ideas from both approaches in order to produce, like an overarching framework for understanding movement coordination and its acquisition, movement control. And they agreed to disagree. And a book came out in 1989 called The Motor Action Controversy, published by North Holland of Amsterdam. Those publishers don't exist anymore. I think they've been taken over. And it pretty much led to this sort of agreeing to disagree. That they couldn't be, you couldn't produce a compatible theory. And the reason is, and the reason still remains now, and this is something I've gone back to look at, is the meta-theoretical foundation. So every theory in science has a backstory, as Alicia Guerrero mentions in her book. And the backstory are the philosophical underpinnings, the assumptions that you implicitly agree to. So if you sign up for a theory, you don't realize it at the time, because you might read a paper and there's a sort of a test, scientific test, etc., or some sort of theoretical rationale. But in a paper, you've got a word limits, some only 3,000, some up to 6,000. You can't keep mentioning the philosophical assumptions, so they kind of get buried and implicit. But the philosophical assumptions of the ecological approach, which is transactionalism, so people are engaged in transactions with the environment, energy exchanges, etc., are different from the philosophical assumptions of the cognitive approach, which is called interactionism. Now, interaction is a term that you would find in ecological writing, but it's not used in the same way. Interactionism is also trait based as well, so that it believes in traits, inherent traits, inherent internal representations, and people interact, but they're in a kind of an isolated way, a bit like billiard balls interact, and the way that Isaac Newton talked about action, reaction, etc., not really engaging in energy exchanges and transactions like that. It's rather more about bumping into each other in the night when people interact. So people are independent entities according to that metaphysical foundation. So a summary message is, it's better really to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of both approaches, recognizing them as in parallel, because there's no way at the moment of integrating them, and there's no way that one can replace the other truthfully, without in terms of one being inaccurate, the other one more valid, if you like. It's really about preference and your worldview. Yeah.
So I was just going to say, just on this, if I'm sure Patreon members will already seen this, but we did write a blog post on this on the Constraints Collective website, September the 5th, 2024. Can coaches pick and mix ideas from different scientific theories to inform their practical application? So we do go into a bit more detail in that blog post. So I'd direct people to that.
Just on that point, one of the conclusions we made in that blog post is you can pick and mix if you're not claiming to use a scientific evidence-based approach to coaching. If you're using practical insights from all over, and you're not worried about the meta-theoretical differences, if that doesn't concern you, then of course you can pick a mix from a practical perspective. But if anyone said to you, is your work evidence-based? Is it rooted in the scientific theory? There's no coherence then, because you're using apples and oranges and
pick a mix.
Pick a mix that way.
So I think, I suppose one of the messages we're trying to get is, we're not saying, oh, you must follow this or you don't do that because that's bad, like, whatever. And I think the key message for coaches, or I suppose the Patreon members really, is that, if your worldview does align to more of an ecological dynamics approach, then that's fine. You don't need to keep looking in the past and maybe getting influenced by incoherent social media messages that don't really help anyone, and there's not a lot of substance to them. I suppose it's how can you be the best practitioner you can be, and how does maybe an ecological dynamics framework support that to help you do that, and how can you contribute to more understanding around these areas? I mean, adopting that approach, and I'm just thinking my experience with a team I've worked with recently, that really helped me, and it gave me a framework to guide my practice and to reflect on and to think about how I can improve things that I might need to dial up, dial down. Yeah, and that really helped me. And we wrote that paper about that as well, Keith, with the wheelchair team. Yeah, so I don't know. Yeah, but rather than looking in the past or maybe sitting on the fence about certain things. So yeah, I don't know if that resonates or helps, but yeah, it's certainly helped me.
Yeah, I think from a practical perspective, there are really nuanced differences. So you're not going to find some new methodology that's proposed by the cognitive approach that's not proposed by the ecological approach, something really wild and different. There'll be subtle differences. So, for example, practice is recognized as being important for coaches, teachers, educators, but in terms of skill acquisition from on either side. But there are subtle differences in how you practice. Some would probably say, not so subtle differences, depending on how close you are. And that's they're advocated by one approach rather than the other. And it's really boils down to that. It's not that you're not going to come across something that is absolutely brand new in one area and not recognizing the other area to be something similar, but it's looking for the subtle differences between the practical applications advocated by the two different theoretical approaches.
Mm.
I think there's a tendency as well to think of when people are doing these comparisons, it's almost like back to 1970s or the 1980s in terms of understanding what the cognitive approach is. So we're still, we're basically at Martinique and information processing and schema theory. And I think cognitive psychology has moved on since then.
Good point.
Yeah, and embedding or really taking notice of the environment or acknowledging the role of the environment more than it ever has. But I think working with some coaches and trying to find out what their beliefs are that underpin their practice, there's often people still hold on to those givens, like the idea of muscle memory, the idea of lots of repetition to get the repeatable action, but still also go, yeah, but we've got to make it real. So they understand, they get the idea of representative practice, but they still deep down believe in the ideal performance model, and idea of muscle memory. So I think there can be some tension there between the two approaches, and then I think it's working with people to try and explode some of those myths in a way.
Well,
Try and bring people, or enlighten people a little bit about what's
yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, for me, when you're talking area, what really jumped out at me is like Fabian Otte's post framework. That's a great example of how you would take some of these ideas and how it would guide your practice. And I've used that to help me think about how I'm going to design, practice and a program over several weeks and months. So I think it's things like that, isn't it? That and then subtle behaviours within that, the way you might use feedback and why can be different. Or, with Gerard's work, Keith, about, looking forward and can it help you navigate the performance landscape rather than looking back and correcting errors. So some of these nuances you talk about, that's, and this idea that we've spoken about before about strengths-based coaching, I think that's where you can see some of these nuances or intentions. So a big learning for me over the past 6 months is this idea of creating the need in practice, or letting the practice create the need for players, athletes, whatever the sport might be, to actively search and find solutions. You're not giving solutions to people. So, what you might see typically is, all right, today we're going to be working on this. So immediately players are thinking, I don't know, like I was going to try and use a cricket example, but I won't. Like, defending a shift in rugby. So when they
Yeah.
when they go wide very quickly to the wing, straight away you're framing what some of the solutions might be, rather
Yeah.
than setting a practice up where you might say to one team, we're going to reward you more if you're scoring in wide positions, and then you don't say anything to the other team. And how
Yeah.
quickly can they work that out? How, because that is performance. The coach and the players, the opposition players, aren't saying to you before the game, we're going to play like this. This is what we're going to do today. So I
Mm.
just think, things like that is where I've seen some real advancements in my practice, and maybe how the players that I'm working with are responding to that as well.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I think there are some key differences, as you mentioned there. When you look at the cognitive approach and the ecological approach, there's some key differences about how practitioners can use, for example, practice. So practice, really the focus is on repetition. And cognitive psychology, remember, historically, it has this sort of engineering technology influence in its inception after World War II. In other blogs I've talked about, written about, but also in other podcasts I've talked about the psychologists and engineers getting together for the war effort in World War II. And then in 1955 came the Hickson Symposium, which was people see as the birth of cognitive psychology. And so there's this engineering technology influence. So when you immediately think of muscle memory, Ian, and that conjures up the idea that there's a chip located in muscle somewhere that can
The
store.
brain,
Yeah,
our brains.
but also in different parts of the body now.
I just,
And people talk about automaticity, for example.
yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I'm I'm just writing a book at the moment, and I found a book. It's a cricket book. Surprise, surprise. Actually, my first ever cricket book. But I found a book by the legendary C.B. Fry. So you remember who C.B. Fry is?
The name rings a bell.
Yeah, so he played cricket for England. I think he played football for England.
Ah,
He was the world record holder for long jumping.
wow.
He's a legend. I mean, he was literally a legend. But he wrote a book in 1920, and he produced, as it says here, one of the most detailed examinations of batsmanship um, ever undertaken. He emphasized that learning to bat was made up of two separate components: the mechanism of the stroke and then the timing.
Mm,
Consequently, trainee batters could develop the mechanism without even hitting a ball. And once the stroke was mastered, working on the timing could follow. And then he said, Fry suggested the batter should see themselves as a live robot or machine, a
yeah.
system of levers whose action in each case must be perfectly adjusted in order to produce the perfect stroke. But then he goes on and say, well, it's not quite that simple. But the ways that he's talked about practice have not changed in cricket
Yeah.
in 100 years. So we're still getting shadow batting, we're still getting hitting off tees, we're still getting, people underarming players at test level, So these things, it's probably before cognitive psychology, but
Mm.
it's still the same principles in a lot of ways. You're a machine, which is like a computer, isn't it?
Yeah,
But
I mean, the engineering influence was actually happening before World War II. Franklin Henry, he's focused on the specificity, the memory motor drum
yeah,
theory. He was a technologist and engineer who went into physical education, and his work he published in the 1930s, 40s. So I think that's always been there. In terms of the influence, and cybernetics was really where feedback came into it, positive
yeah,
reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and that was around World War II. So to go back to the point I'm making, there's some big differences. Well, sort of within the not gigantic differences, but large differences in terms of how they see practice. So one is much about repetition, rehearsal, making things automatic, maybe enhancing muscle memory. And another practice is searching for a better relationship with the environment. So the difference really is less, the interactionism, that meta theory that underpins cognitive psychology is all about internal traits, characteristics, properties developed, rehearsed, and people become more skillful. And I think the C.B. Fry quote there really showed it nicely. And then the other one is more about developing a better relationship with the environment. So always, from an ecological perspective, you've always got to talk about the person-environment relationship. If you're talking about the person only or the environment only, one theory is more environmentalist, and I think behaviorism is an environmentalist theory. And another approach is, internal. So if you ever focus on a solution that is all about the individual and doesn't consider the environment, that's an error. That's a kind of philosophical error. And you're actually operating in a different meta theory at the time you're thinking about that.
So, Keith, can I ask a theoretician a question as a practitioner? So what you've just said there to me now. I'm a practitioner. I'm thinking that's enough for me. That's it. I'm going to sit here.
And I wouldn't blame you. Yeah.
I might want to pick up one of these books over here and just occasionally, so the very applied ones like the NLP one,
Yeah.
and the constraint set one, and just reference certain things to maybe challenge me thinking. So like your reflection tool, Ian, that I keep banging on about, which I think is really useful, and I use it with coaches all the time. That's enough for me. How would you judge that comment, Keith? Would you be annoyed, or
No.
in terms of how am me getting better as a coach to help athletes get better?
Yeah. I would say that you gave a great example before, Fabianotti, for example. He's coaching at a very high level in the English Premier League. He's coached internationally. He was the US goalkeeping coach for a while. And he's got to grips with the theory, the concepts. If you look around, there are high-level practitioners all over who are making the effort to get to grips with the theory and the concepts. I'm not saying that you have to undertake a PhD or study or do a master's degree. Not saying that at all. But what I'm saying is that if you make an effort to understand the concepts, like other coaches, like other practitioners have, it will enrich your coaching. It will reward you. Because otherwise you're coaching by numbers. You're just sort of, if you like, there's a sort of a practical book and it's step 1, step 2, step 3, and that practical book could be cognitive steps or ecological steps, and you're coaching by numbers. And if somebody asks you why you're doing that, your only really truthful response would be because number 4 comes after number 3, and number 5 comes after number 4. It's not really about explaining to somebody, well, this is what I think's going on. I've looked at the ideas behind it, and I'm comfortable with those ideas. For example, I'm comfortable with the notion that practice is more of a search, and my job is as a coach is to design puzzles, solutions, problems, challenges that are game related, performance related, that athletes can search. My job is not to instruct, to command, order, and give people repetition just for the sake of repetition. So I would kind of explain it that way, Martin.
Yeah. No, I was trying to be a little bit provocative but for me, that's enough. So I'll give you a real life example. So on Monday and Tuesday this week, myself and a colleague were working with some coaches via the Premier League on the Index program, and we were doing a series of games, like not football specific, exactly for that, to search for like collective team behavior, try and coordinate behavior around pressing actions and all these sort of things. And most of this is great. I've never thought of doing pressing like this before, and we normally have tactic boards and all this, and then this one guy goes, yeah, but that's not coaching, is it? And it's like, right, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
let's try and unpack what you actually mean by that. And
Yeah.
so basically, and what we got to when we really drilled down why was,
Yeah.
well, you're not standing there giving instruction,
Yeah.
stopping it every 3 or 4 minutes, feedback, do that, do this, do this, do the
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't have it. That's not coaching.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so it's
And
really, and this stems back. You mentioned about post World War II and all these sort of things. It really stems back to there, doesn't it?
It does.
But
It does.
so there probably this chap's worldview is very
I, I
information
think that's
cognitive psychology type, whereas
Yeah.
our worldview is definitely
Mm.
explore the environment,
Yeah.
searching for opportunities to act together in this situation. So yeah, really interesting. Mm.
Martin. I think again in the Lyle and Cushion book, it talks about the 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 people who are the coaches shape what coaching is.
Yes.
They decide what coaching should be, and that's been
Yeah.
deeply held over a long period of time. So there
Yeah.
is an expectation that there will be demonstrations, there will be an expectation that there will be a practice and feedback and prescriptive, the da da
Yeah.
da. And
Yeah.
if you don't do that, then you're not coaching. I've had the same response when I've coached.
Well,
So
you'd fail a coach education course probably.
Yeah,
yeah,
well,
yeah,
that's it. I think that's like the form of life that an
Yeah.
organization have. But the point I'd want to make there is you can still use feedback. So, from a cognitive
Mm.
perspective, the emphasis has been on the magnitude of feedback. For example, how much feedback, how much information you give, when, where, and all the sort of mechanistic stuff. But feedback exists from an ecological approach, and it's about information, the structure of the feedback, whether it refers to does it refer to perceptual information, and augmented information is not so much to command, do it this way from an ecological perspective, it's to guide the search. So this, as I said, you're not going to find anything completely different or something missing. It's all there. It's
Mm.
just delivered, if you like, and carried
Mm.
out in a different way.
Yeah.
And to say that, oh, that's not coaching, is someone that is really kind of, if you like, captured by a system, captured by an organization's definition of what learning is.
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
valued? What's valued in that
Yes,
environment, that in that culture, in that form of life as
exactly.
well?
Yeah.
I mean, the other challenge I think for a lot of our coaches is if they're working with kids is what are parents expecting?
Yes, that's
As
another
well.
thing. Yeah.
They're like, oh, you're not coaching. That's not coaching. You've not corrected them there. Like you can see that they're making big errors here, and you're not trying to correct that error. Well, I am,
Yeah.
but not like you were expecting me to do.
Yeah, and
Learning, not an error. Yeah.
there's a lot of papers coming out now, take Rob Gray's work there, of actually exploring errors, exploiting the value of errors in
Yeah.
a deliberate way rather than just by accident, and then you're depending on someone being a better searcher or a better explorer than somebody else. But a coach setting up possibilities to make an error and explore what that means and then adapt. So kind of facilitating that skill adaptation approach rather than just leaving it down to the individual to find.
I can give you a good example, Keith. I had a batter who was hitting early on the drives and chipping
Mm,
it up to mid on and mid off.
mm.
Because they were taking the ball early. And I said, well, really be good here. I want you to hit one along the ground. I want you to hit one to them. And then I
Mm.
want you to hit one off. And they're looking at me going, you want me to get out? You know, well, why would I want to practice getting out? Because I want you to feel what it's looked like. I want you to
Yeah,
feel
yeah.
being hitting it there and then hitting it later and hitting it
The
on the ground
difference,
or
yeah. So they explore the difference.
exploring the
Yeah,
difference.
yeah.
And
So
one or two, yeah,
I
one or
was
two
just
of the
saying,
coaches going, "Ugh," and others
yeah,
going, yeah, yeah.
I know, but I think that's you focusing on learning rather
Yeah.
than coaching, and I think this is a bit of a difference with the cognitive approach. Is that I'm not saying that all cognitive psychologists focus on the teaching, the coaching, the instructing. Some do focus on the learning, obviously, but I think from a transactional ecological approach, your relationship with the environment. It facilitates that emphasis on learning. And so that type of method you use there, I think is a really good, interesting method to explore and develop. But it definitely focuses on the learner experiencing what it's like to pick up information when they make a stroke that gets them out, compared to a stroke where they can't get out because the ball's along the ground, unless they run out, you know.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. I think I got the feeling we're just warming up. Well, I
Yeah.
know we can't have these 2-3 hour podcasts. We just haven't got the time. But yeah, great insights again, gents. I really appreciate the time and the insights. Hopefully the Patreon members get something from it. So
So just to summarize, don't get hung up in worrying about this versus that.
Yeah.
And if you're interested in this whole approach, just let's focus on how to get better at doing this approach, because there's still enough questions to answer without worrying about what other people are doing or the old.
Yeah.
definitely.
Right.
Yeah.
Brill. All right. Thanks, gents.
Good. Thanks.